Mr. President, I rise also in opposition to the nomination of John Kenneth Bush. Mr. Bush has been nominated to serve as a judge in the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, has the dubious distinction of having anonymously written scores of blog posts that aren't just offensive, which, believe me, they are, but call into question the nominee's ability to be a fair and impartial arbiter of the law, that's the job of a judge, especially a circuit court judge. In my view, Mr. President, the nominee's lengthy record of inflammatory and intemperate writings stand as evidence that Mr. Bush falls far short of the high standards that the Senate should demand of nominees to the federal bench. Now, over the course of nearly 10 years, Mr. Bush wrote under the pseudonym G. Morris. He wrote under a pseudonym on a political blog operated by his wife, where he published hundreds of incendiary posts. Now, let me be absolutely clear. Being politically active or expressing political opinions is not a disqualifying characteristic in a judicial nominee, at least not in my view. But, as I said during Mr. Bush's hearing, it's important for the Senate, in attempting to determine whether a nominee is qualified to serve as a federal judge, to assess that nominee's judgment. The judge must assess his or her judgment. And that's what I would like the President and all our members to consider. In the hundreds upon hundreds of posts that Mr. Bush anonymously published on his wife's blog, Mr. Bush did not demonstrate what any member of this body would characterize as good judgment. Far from it. During his hearing, I questioned the nominee about a series of posts in which he seemed to fixate on President Obama's Kenyan heritage. In one post, Mr. Bush discussed an article that suggested that a reporter was detained by the Kenyan government because he was investigating, quote, Barack Obama's connections in the country, and that authorities had locked up the reporter in order to prevent him from publishing what he discovered. The article that Mr. Bush quoted from and linked to was published on WorldNet Daily, a website known for peddling conspiracy theories, bogus claims, and white nationalism. In fact, WorldNet Daily is widely known for trafficking in birtherism, the widely debunked and racist belief that President Obama was not born in this country. Nonetheless, Mr. Bush presented the WorldNet Daily article as fact. This is a guy who's been nominated to be a circuit court judge, calling it WorldNet Daily article fact. So during his confirmation hearing, I asked Mr. Bush, and I asked him over and over again, how he decided which sources to rely upon in his writings, and how he determined that a particular source was credible. In my view, whether a nominee is capable of discerning real news from fake news or blogs that traffic in conspiracy theories from legitimate journalism directly speaks to the nominee's judgment. Again, the job is judge. Really now, WorldNet Daily. Whether and how a nominee evaluates the credibility of a claim or a source of information provides a window into how he might approach the factual record in a case, for example. That's what judges do. But Mr. Bush couldn't answer my question. Instead, he said, quote, As a blogger, I was finding things that were in the news that were of note, I thought. In response to a written question I posed, Mr. Bush said, rather than perform original research to support his claims, he instead, quote, relied upon readily available sources on the internet. That would be the prestigious internet. Really? Really? From a nominee for the circuit court? This begs the question. How did Mr. Bush find these articles? Does the nominee consume a steady diet of disinformation and conspiracy theories? I asked him that writing in question. Mr. Bush responded that he did not remember how he came upon those sources. And that, in fact, aside from the articles he quoted, that he did not recall reading any articles from those sources, despite the fact that he linked to and quoted liberally from conspiracy-minded websites many times in his writings. But Mr. President, despite Mr. Bush's claims that he can't remember how it was that World Net Daily found its way onto his computer screen, and despite his claim that he can't recall how he discovered and then later cited the writings of a birther conspiracy theorist, I suspect that in Mr. Bush's case, the simplest explanation is probably the right one. I suspect that the reason Mr. Bush quoted from sources like World Net Daily so frequently is that Mr. Bush frequented those sources, that he frequently read the material that they published, and I suspect that he enjoyed it. That's just a suspicion based on my judgment. Mr. President, the fact that a man who anonymously wrote inflammatory and offensive blog posts and who consumed information from sources that routinely published lies and racially insensitive material could be confirmed to a lifetime appointment on one of the U.S. Courts of Appeals should shock the conscience of each and every member of the Senate, no matter what your politics are. I have served on the Judiciary Committee for 8 years, and during that time, I've had the opportunity to evaluate countless judicial nominees. I understand that each senator has his or her own way of determining whether a nominee should be confirmed. Some senators prefer nominees who embrace a judicial philosophy of originalism or strict constructionism. Others reject that view. For some senators, the nominee's view of the Second Amendment or Roe v. Wade serves as a litmus test. But Mr. President, setting aside the usual yardsticks by which we measure judicial nominees, Mr. Bush should strike each and every member of this body as manifestly unqualified by any measure through his writings alone. And I urge all of my colleagues simply to look at his writings on his blog or on his wife's blog that he wrote with a pseudonym. They're awful. They're disgraceful. Please, I beg my colleagues, read these and say to yourself, is this really, are these writings the writings of a man, no matter what his leanings are in terms of how constitutional law should be decided, what his philosophy is, conservative or progressive or liberal, how we can confirm someone to the circuit court, to a federal judgeship for life, who writes anonymously these awful, incendiary things, relying on sources that are known for spreading hatred. and linking to them. I don't think we've been here before. I don't think we've been here before. I would beg my colleagues, before you cast this vote, that I believe that you could not justify to your constituents, that you could not justify to your family. Please read these blog posts by this nominee and check your conscience, not at the door. Check it. This is one of those incredibly unusual circumstances where someone comes before us who I believe is uniquely unqualified for the job.